Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm your host, Brittany Satterfield. Today's session is provided to you by the International Knowledge Aware Association, a nonprofit organization built to assist organizations in transforming through knowledge-aware concepts. Today we'll be sharing a framework for enterprise knowledge flows and organizational learning for the knowledge-aware approach. Today, I have the pleasure to have two other founding IKAA board members with me, Jeff Maffa and Tim Glau. Jeff has over 15 years of experience with the knowledge-aware approach and has been one of the primary contributors of the concept of knowledge-aware. Jeff is also the president of Oros Knowledge Systems. And with us today, we have Tim Glau. Tim is responsible for Caterpillar's technical communities of practice and knowledge management programs, driving culture, standard work processes, and technologies that help grow the breadth and depth of sustainable competency, skills, and knowledge. Tim created and developed Caterpillar's current Knowledge in the Flow program. Tim also resides on the board of the IKAA. So from a high level today, we'll start off by giving you a brief introduction to the knowledge-aware approach. Then we'll introduce you to what requirements are and show you some of the types. Then we'll walk you through the knowledge flow model and the Delta model for knowledge-aware. And at the end, we'll open up to Q&A and share where you can find additional resources that might be helpful. And before I pass it off to Jeff and Tim, as a quick disclaimer, statements expressed in this webinar by Tim Glau stem from his personal experiences and may not fully reflect the views of future direction of Caterpillars Incorporated and its affiliates. All right, so let's get in it. Jeff, would you mind starting us off with a brief introduction on the knowledge-aware approach?
Sure thing. Thanks, Brittany. So the way we introduce the knowledge-aware approach, and for those of you who are familiar, are probably also familiar with our metaphor. So the way we explain the knowledge-aware approach is by using the metaphor of a paper map. So a paper map is very useful information. It's a document that contains all the possible turns and roads in a given area, and if you aren't familiar with that area, it's extremely useful. But it's not real practical to use, right? In terms of navigating. When you're driving around, unfurling a map on your lap doesn't work really well. And consequently, today, because of technology, we all have a better way of getting around. And that way is, of course, navigation. So what's going on with navigation? I think the most important thing to see, or one of the important things I should say, is that the navigation app is giving you only the information you need as you need it based on your context. By context, we mean, or in the case of a cell phone navigation, it's GPS. The GPS knows where you are, and just the portion of the map that's relevant to where you are is being shown at any given time. It's also giving you further insights with the turn directions. And this makes the map experience and the navigation experience very different, and everybody choosing the navigation interface as the better way of getting around. But less obvious, but just as important, is that the navigation app is also collecting data about what other drivers are doing as they drive through the area. And with that data, it's able to produce extremely valuable insights like estimated time to arrival and traffic, right? And also is validating their turn-by-turn algorithms. If you don't take a turn and the next guy doesn't take a turn and the next person doesn't take a turn, well, that turn may not be a valid turn. So by collecting data about what others are doing when the maps are being used, we're able to produce insights. And with a paper map, the document approach, this just isn't possible. So what we're suggesting with the knowledge-aware approach is that we move from the document world to the knowledge-based world where knowledge is provisioned within context and validated through reuse, right? And so that is, in essence, the knowledge-aware approach. So now that we have a course, and I understand a very coarse understanding of what the knowledge-aware approach is, let's talk a little bit more about knowledge and what knowledge is. Now, we're going to talk here in this particular podcast, we want to introduce a knowledge flow model for organizations. And understanding knowledge flows, we first have to come to terms with this term called requirement. And we need to talk about requirement because it's a confusing term. To systems engineers, requirements mean something. But when you canvas the broader organization, requirement takes on a much more general, knowledge-y type term. So that if a certain part needs to have locators in a certain way to get the part to locate with consistency, some people call those things requirements. But in the traditional systems engineering world, they're not really the same thing. So what we're introducing is this idea of requirement being a big R requirement and knowledge kind of being requirements, if you want to call it little r requirements. And with these definitions, we need to understand, is that an important difference or is that a made-up difference? And the knowledge flow model is going to explain why it's an extremely important difference and why our techniques and management process might be slightly different one versus the other.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So let's talk about the knowledge flow model. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So let's talk about what this means. So let's start with the traditional idea of requirements as a form of knowledge, the big R. This is a flow down process, and the systems engineers out there will be very familiar with what flow down means. But it basically means is that we have an ultimate customer requirement. So in automotive world, the common ones are like how fast a car should be able to brake from 60 to 0 in terms of a distance, 110 feet, 90 feet. And it'd be dependent on the segment of the car. That is a customer-driven requirement. And then these then can break down into successively finer-grained requirements. Okay, if we're going to brake the car in that distance, and the car weighs a certain amount, we need to dissipate so much energy. And if we dissipate that much energy, we need to have a certain architecture of brake. And if we're going to have that kind of brake, we need to have a certain kind of frictional surface area. You get the idea. And so this kind of requirements decomposition or flow down is repeated. Okay, so we need a system to do that handles flow down and tracing. However, that isn't the end of it. We need to understand our ability to meet those requirements. And that's where this idea of the little r comes in. And so this flow model, introduces this concept called flow up. And flow up is different. There's no ultimate source of truth for flow up, right? So flow up has different stakeholders if we go back to the braking example, how do we want to stop the car in that distance? What kind of brake architectures can we explore? Piston, dual piston, maybe a different brake architecture altogether, drum style brake, and look at the trade-offs. And then once you have a brake architecture, there's all kinds of rules that you might have about cost versus weight trade-offs. And these have different stakeholders involved. So we call this process of flow up a controlled crowdsourced process because we're going to control and merge the varying stakeholders' needs and wants. And more importantly, provision that to the flow down process so that we can have access, the knowledge of execution, to the requirements that are coming in the flow down process. So you can see there's a very different way the knowledge evolves and is life cycled, but their ultimate source and formulation are very different. They're going to share something that we'll talk about in a second, but for now they're very different. Next, we're going to introduce this concept of flow in. Now, flow in is the idea that there are external standards that aren't big R requirements. They are knowledge about first principle or external standards that are that are useful to the process that will help glue controlled crowdsourced knowledge or little r's in the context of big R requirements flow down, ultimate customer requirements. And there's lots of examples of this. External standards come from SAE, in shipbuilding ABS. Sometimes you can consider FMVSS a big R, but it's also this kind of flow-in concept. So now that we've got these three flows that are cultivated and managed in different ways, what the knowledge-aware vision for knowledge flows says is that we should not treat these as text or documents, as we said in the map kind of navigation metaphor, but we really need to stream or provision these knowledge streams in a format that's readied for reuse. So we need to turn these into items that have enough metadata or structure around them that we can provision them as they're needed to the context. Where are you in your project? What kind of project is it? And these kinds of contexts should cause the right knowledge flow to bring these units of knowledge that are already readied for reuse. And by readied for reuse, we refer to these three attributes of actionable, granular, and vital. But these are items that are ready for use. In the map example, a map tile is ready for reuse, right? It is certainly actionable, it's correct, it's vital, and it's granular. It's the right size so that as I'm traveling, it's only giving me the information I need, granular. Okay, and so in the engineering world, then we get to the model-based enterprise. And the model-based enterprise is the concept that all our engineering processes, all our technical processes, and even non-technical processes are being driven by models. So this is a digital environment. CAD is a model, PLM is a model, process planning is a model, CAE are models, and models can be interfaced. And today's processes demand that we're going to be able to deliver knowledge to these models, and the models will be able to consume them and make use of them. So what we want the flow model to do is not only to integrate flow up and flow down and flow in, but also ensure that the stream of knowledge coming into the model-based world is consumable by models and usable, leverageable by these models. Lastly, and most importantly in this flows diagram is our ability to collect data about how the knowledge is getting used. I mentioned in the metaphor that the navigation app is able to take which turns you're taking, how fast you're driving, and turning into useful insights. Well, if we're able to apply digitally this streamed knowledge into the model-based world, we can collect data about how that knowledge is being used. Not meeting a requirement or a standard or little r is akin to not taking that right turn. We should be able to then use that data to decide which turns we don't really take and what we might be actually doing to improve performance of our engineering teams. So we call this flow back, and this is a prime area for AI and other analytic techniques to produce insights from this data that you can only get out of the knowledge-aware process. So we call this flow back. So we take the data, we turn it into insights, and we provide that to the flow-up process to bolster and improve the controlled crowdsourced knowledge. So it's a different tool and integration that's used in the flow-up process. And by doing this, we actually can create a closed-loop learning process where an organization becomes more intelligent, more efficient over time. And that's the point. So some of you probably have mental models that are very similar to this knowledge-aware knowledge flows model already. And hopefully that these terms are meaningful to you. Those of you who haven't maybe thought of it this way, take some time to think about it. The flow up and how that works with flow down, and how by readying knowledge for reuse in the same way that map tiles are readied for reuse in navigation, we can make efficient the process of applying knowledge, be much more thorough about it, and produce insights about what we know, how we know, and what we do that will only improve our ability to provision knowledge in the future with the flow back. So that's in a nutshell. Now, my colleague Tim here is going to explain a more person-oriented view that we call the Delta model, that Tim calls the Delta model, on top of the knowledge flow model. Tim?
I want to extend a thank you to Jeff, Brittany, and all our International Knowledge Aware Association members who are able to join us today. And I just want to say I appreciate the invitation to be here. So let's go ahead and discuss this important topic. And let me start by saying that how I really appreciate our IKAA organization taking the initiative to advance what is seen as paradigm shifting and transformative not going to where the knowledge is archived or stored, but what can be considered the reverse, looking for ways in-context knowledge can be brought into the decision-making moment. All of us must remember, as you know, Jeff, that both knowledge and people have a very unique, symbiotic, or in other words, interdependent relationship. You simply can't have one without the other. Although they are distinct, what I want to emphasize here is that you can't grow or mature one without the other, knowledge and people. So as we contemplate how knowledge flows within the model-based enterprise to effect, we can't ignore the importance of growth and maturity of people within organizations across the many different subject domains that there are. Let's take a look at the knowledge-aware cyclical model for people and organizational development. It is helpful to consider the developmental and transformational impact active knowledge can have on people and organizations at a larger scale in general. Knowledge provision streams are oriented and starts with the knowledge consumer. Consumer response refreshes the knowledge ecosystem. Now, since starting in the field of knowledge management in 1997, one of the largest traditional KM challenges I've seen has been related to valuation. And I'm happy to see how the knowledge-aware technique provides a pattern of how intangible or tangible impact even can be elevated within the enterprise. That knowledge and that value is rooted in the measurement of an assessment of provisioned and responsive knowledge, which means active and vibrant sets of knowledge oriented around consumer applicability and usefulness. So to accomplish that, we first need to understand how knowledge consumer responses match what we already know. Is it the same or is it different? Do knowledge consumer responses have similarity to what is expected? In mathematics, we call the variation between actual and expected as a delta variation. The greater this delta deviation or divide, the more our system will need to take action to react, to course correct, evaluate, explore, or what I might think of as learn why the deviation exists. This is important because it's in order to improve the future matches that we want, consumer and machine learning, or AI, as part of that, we need to really do this matching exercise. So being an engineer, I think of feedback or flowback to be similar to a control system employing a proportional integral derivative, or what we call a PID controller. So in other words, in layman's terms, a closed-loop system that takes resulting adjustments back into a newly restated and modified input. Now, Jeff previously discussed the function of flowback or feedback. When we additively consider the people perspective, we start to see how we are reducing needed intervention from human involvement and cognition out of real-time feedback filtering. What I call knowledge health analytics is really meant to be a visual representation of the delta divide measure, or an ongoing trace of measurement trends that stem from real-time feedback filtering process. Now, for filtered unfavorable responses, our knowledge delta response will be similar to a red conditional state. When responses are closer to a green state, this signifies how the delivered knowledge more closely matched a consumer's need in context to the application in question. For those situations, a knowledge community review will have less importance than a red conditional state, because the red state signifies a greater deviation from what was expected out of a knowledge delivery stream in terms of the problem set or task for completion. The degree or magnitude of the delta divide can be filtered, prioritized, and brought to the attention of an appropriate knowledge community for evaluation. It's kind of like with triage in a medical sense. These knowledge communities would act upon the most conspicuous deviations first, meaning these red state responses. Now, the overarching purpose here is to maintain health within the knowledge ecosystem so that future knowledge streams will have a richer, more applicable content impacting knowledge consumer needs. What we can see in these cyclical pattern knowledge delivery streams, responses, and evaluations are how individuals are getting new knowledge that they haven't traditionally had before. The knowledge consumer is quickly presented what the knowledge ecosystem has, thereby exposing potential risks behind a consumer's decision-making options. The knowledge community and their authors are getting feedback that they haven't previously had on how well their knowledge is impacting process task completion and problem solving from the consumer level. So subsequently, in red delta cases, the knowledge community can either direct their resources to do one of two things: provide the knowledge consumer a learning opportunity and correct that behavior, or reevaluate the existing knowledge provided earlier and refresh that knowledge before placing it back into the cycle. The reason a knowledge consumer might deviate from what was provisioned does not necessarily mandate a series of required efforts to correct behavior. Ultimately, it's the individual's response back into the knowledge ecosystem that is used to define the effectiveness of knowledge. So maybe it'll be helpful if we study example here. So let's take a look at the sidewalk path that I have here in this picture. And if I was to ask you what you see, what do you see here and how would you put it in terms of green and red states? So let's think about that. So you have a couple sidewalk paths there. So let's take a look. So for the sidewalk's design intent, it is represented and shown with green deltas in this picture. The sidewalk was meant to be a way for people to get across from one side of the street in a business establishment there to a parking lot on the other side of the street via two different access points. Now the red here, the evidence shows that the establishment's visitors are exhibiting an alternative behavior. They are making more of a direct path across the grass to the parking lot on the opposite side of the road. So in this example, we can see that a deviation from what was intended is somewhere, I would say, in the area of 6 to 8 feet approximately. So in other words, the distance between the intended path and the actual path becomes this delta divide that I'm talking about. We should also make note here that there is a more distant alternative path that has a crosswalk and traffic lights to the right for safety, because safety is always important for our people. All right, so restating from an earlier slide, red is not bad, but it's just different than what was expected. So 3 possible feedback outcomes might include here. 1 would be correction, which you might block off, fence off, or enforce the path to the intended design. It might be 2, modification, where I change the intended path to better match the actual path taken, or 3, basically do nothing because there's no value in making the change. But what I'm trying to state here, similar to this case example, is how we desire for our organizations, our teams, and our people to grow through the understanding of the differences causing a delta divide like this. Our knowledge will mature, yes, but the idea is that we want our people to grow along with it as an important part of this journey. So let's take a deeper look at consumer decisions on the next slide. Perhaps it can be visualized this way. Responses will tend to be more favorably accepted if the consumer has previous subject matter experiences or learning, and the presented material is authoritative in connection with application being addressed. So on the contrary, a knowledge consumer will ignore delivered content as irrelevant if they don't know the source or don't understand the subject domain. So the green and red states mentioned earlier are more likely to be instantaneous decisions, driving a more rapid response in terms of the knowledge presented. If an individual is more aware of the subject domain and is presented unreliable information, a time delay will occur in order to verify or prove the content's usability in the application's context. Now, if the knowledge is verified, sanctioned, or authoritative, this is great, but we will still have some risk because there's a decision-making there that's due to a lack of consumer confidence that might be delayed as well. So, of course, the knowledge consumer may blindly move forward with the knowledge presented, but this is not an ideal situation when we're talking about people development. So let's take a closer look at how these people and knowledge-based decisions interrelate. We discussed the interdependent relationship between knowledge and people across multiple and varied functional domains. Now, how do they relate and affect the decisions people need to make? So let's consider a 3-axis Cartesian coordinate system that shows an X, a Y, and a Z axis for people, knowledge, and COPs respectively. And let's assume also that these axes represent the depth and breadth of our organizations, where the measurement of the organization might be characterized through the contribution and maturity depth of our people, the complex details and depth of our collective knowledge, and those communities are pulled together to nurture and advance identified domains aligned to the function of our organization and delight our customers. Now, some of the examples of what you might find as measuring sticks for each of these is experience, expertise, skill, detail, and sophistication in knowledge sets. The strength of our peer reviews and how our domain knowledge transcends our organization is also there. Since we don't just consider the knowledge we have today, but the knowledge that we will need in the future, we also desire for our communities to nurture career paths, driving depth into our people along the lines of functional disciplines. Now, for every given decision, a certain level of knowledge is required to have enough sound judgment for decision making. What we want to strive for is our decisions to be made in both terms of deliverable outcomes and in a balanced or consistent way, irrespective of an assigned individual's contribution or maturity depth. Now, at this point, required knowledge will be independent from people until an individual or individuals are assigned to address the problem that needs solving or task completion. So the reality is, as you all will know, is that the level of contribution varies, and it will vary depending on where the employee is at during the course of their career. So at different career points, contribution and knowledge will vary. Now, age is not the singularly important factor here in that we change jobs, for instance, and we may fall back down the curve to need knowledge again at maybe a different subject matter or something. Earlier on in this process, the level of required knowledge one will need gap closure to get to what is required. So for your knowledge-aware programs, what I'm challenging you to do here is to look for gap closure accelerants. Under a variety of scenarios, develop programs that will help you to become nimble in closing knowledge gaps more quickly as part of your knowledge-aware strategy. So if you look here at the 1X, 2X, and 3X, what we're talking about is improving your time-based measures for decision closure. Now, as I've previously shown, a huge helping of green deltas delivered with knowledge-aware technique will speed up decision-making and do so with higher quality and lower risks in those decisions. On the flip side of needing knowledge are those who can contribute knowledge. So for those individuals, we want to tap into their knowledge so that those who need knowledge have a resource. Now, the point of all this is that the further deviation from the level of required knowledge line, the further risk you have for downstream decisions as a result of this decision matrix here, this decision level of this curve. And I hope that you will see the goal that's emerging here. The goal here is this, that we desire for a balance of decisions across teams and organizations, leveraging the knowledge-aware technique, while at the same time, a maturation of our people's abilities to make future decisions. So there's two critical to quality measures to communicate to your leadership concerning the contributing value of knowledge-aware technique. And it's this. One, there's increases in speed and efficiency in your ability to make decisions. And two, having an application of the right knowledge to produce lower risk and higher quality decisions. Now, I'm of the belief that you will find paradigm-shifting value within a nexus of consistent decisions across your employees, your teams, divisions, and organizations, regardless of the tacit or explicit-oriented knowledge retained. Okay, the head knowledge or the things that are written down. So you will reduce the isolated pockets of knowledge found only in select individuals when you do this. You will have a pattern for growing your teams, bringing value to your organization. So in summary, I'm truly excited about this next chapter to grow beyond knowledge management. If you want to learn more, I would challenge you to go to www.knowledge-aware.org, become a member. In fact, why don't you challenge your organization to become a corporate sponsor and take your knowledge-based enterprise to the next level. That's about all I have, so thank you, everyone. I guess back to you, Brittany and Jeff.
All right, so now it's time for the Q&A session. So at this time, if you have any questions, please type your questions into the chat box now. So right now we're going to start off by answering the questions that were asked earlier in the presentation. First one, okay, this one's on the delta divide. Sounds great, but how do I find and measure the delta? So Tim, you want to take this one?
That's a good question. So traditionally, I would ask within your organizations, how do you do that today? I know that within our organization, we have design reviews, which many of you may be familiar with. And so that's usually a group of leaders and engineers and a bunch of people from different aspects of the organization coming together and assessing, what they think of from a knowledge perspective related to these red or green states, what we call things that are within what we expect versus not what we expect. I would say even informally, this probably happens even in your small teams too, right, before it gets to a design review. And the issue on both cases is that they're not really made aware or available to everybody when those decisions are being made. What the knowledge-aware technique allows us to do is it's a byproduct of what we're doing within this technique. And it's something that when we go through it, we can then be able to quickly assess how the knowledge is being addressed or how it would actually address the problem state. And it's done in a way that everybody's made visible, both consumers as well as our technical communities.
All right, thank you, Tim. Let's go one more question. You mentioned knowledge community a couple times. What is knowledge community?
Okay, so knowledge community here, many of you may be familiar with the concept of community of practice. And a community of practice tends to be those individuals that come around and are passionate about, let's say, some aspect of how you do work. In the case that I'm describing here is I'm challenging on a technical community or something where some community where we can evaluate the knowledge that's being brought in that cycle, in that feedback cycle. So in other words, what we want to do is when we get a difference between a red and a green state that's very high, we want to filter more of those to the top, yes, but what do we do once we get it? We need a body or a group of people that can evaluate that knowledge and then be able to assess whether or not some action needs to be taken and how drastic of an action, what projects, maybe there's some offshoots into some issues lists or things that we need to do. And we want to make sure that we get that knowledge healthy so that when we put it back in the stream for the next iteration, that it will be something that can be valued and used by our consumers.
So Tim, in your organization, do you have these communities recognized as formally as a community, or do these things form and dissipate organically?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, for clarifying. So in our organization, we started out with a top-down approach, but found quickly that we were more effective when we organically grew our communities, especially when we focus in the technical area, because mathematically those have some use, especially in the knowledge-aware technique, as we start to think about how we can apply and make use of knowledge. Logic and so forth is very valuable. In our organization, we built them organically, we make them formal. We work on both knowledge and people as being two important pieces that a community comprises of. So in both cases, we want to mature and nurture and grow both our people and our knowledge because, like I said before, they're a symbiotic relationship. They're interdependent of each other.
All right, so I do want to make sure there's enough time to go through the last few slides, so I'm going to close out Q&A at this time. For those who didn't hear their questions, we'll reach out to you individually following the session today. So before you leave today, I want to tell you about this upcoming Knowledge Aware Conference. In case you haven't heard, the 2000 Knowledge Aware Conference is coming up next month in Plymouth, Michigan. It will be held on September 25th and 26th, and I'd really like to encourage you to register for this event. It's a 2-day event full of great breakout sessions, speaker sessions, all on the Knowledge Aware approach. And just for attending this webinar today, you can save $100 off registration by signing up today with the coupon code KNOWLEDGEFLOWS. To learn more about the Knowledge Aware Conference or to register, visit kaaconference.org. And like Tim mentioned before, we really want to encourage you to join as a member of the IKAA. So to learn more about the membership, visit knowledge-aware.org. And that's it for today. Tim, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today, and for everyone that joined us today, thank you. And if you don't mind, please take a minute to complete the survey that pops up after we close out today. It will be truly appreciated. Thanks for coming, and we hope to see you at the Knowledge Aware Conference this September. Bye!